Hello and welcome to today's Soton Anatomy Hub video. My name's Deeps and I'm going to be talking to you today about the axillary artery and all of its branches. So let's get stuck right in. Now the axillary artery, like its name suggests, lies in the axilla. Now this can be a bit of a difficult area of anatomy to wrap your head around because it has a lot of fiddly structures all packed into one small area. So to make things a little bit easier to understand, let's try and orientate ourselves around the main landmarks and surrounding structures first, before we get into the vasculature. Let's first start with a small muscle right at the top, which is the anterior scalene muscle. If you look carefully, you can see that it's attached to the first rib, and that's because one of its functions is to elevate the first rib when taking a really deep breath in, and it's also used for lateral flexion and rotation of the cervical spine. If we pan down a bit, the second muscle is pectoralis minor, which inserts onto the coracoid process of the scapula. Now its functions include moving and stabilising the scapula, as well as elevating the ribs during deep inspiration. Now keep this muscle in mind, because we'll come back to it when we talk about the parts of the axillary artery later on. Finally, right at the bottom, we have teres major. This you can see attaches to the humerus and towards the back attaches to the scapula. Now the main functions of this muscle are to medially rotate and adduct the humerus in towards the body. Fabulous! Now we've discussed the surrounding structures and gotten ourselves orientated. Let's get stuck in with the vasculature and the course of the axillary artery. So let's start off at the top, where it's a subclavian artery. The subclavian passes underneath the anterior scalene muscle and over the first rib. And here we need to start paying attention, because it's at the lateral border of the first rib where we stop calling it the subclavian artery and start calling it the axillary artery, the focus of today's video. Now, we can split the axillary artery even further into three parts. Part 1 spans between the lateral border of the first rib and the medial border of pec minor. You might remember earlier I told you to keep pec minor in mind, and that's because the second section of the axillary artery is a part of the artery that runs directly behind this muscle. Pretty easy to remember, not as easy to see because it's all tucked away. Finally, the third part of the axillary artery runs from the lateral border of pec minor all the way down to the lateral border of teres major. So, we have one artery, which we've nicely split into three parts, and this is going to really help us remember where the 5 branches of the axillary artery originate. The first part gives rise to one branch, the second part gives rise to 2 of the branches, and you guessed it, the third part gives rise to the last 3 branches. So there's a super easy way for you to remember where the branches originate from, and there's also a mnemonic to help you remember the names of the branches as well. Sometimes life seems a pain. It's not exactly the most positive mnemonic, but if it helps you remember the names of the branches, that's all that matters. So let's talk through each of them one by one. The first branch is a superior thoracic artery, and this branches off and continues anteriorly and medially to supply the first and second intercostal spaces. Our next 2 arteries originate from just behind pec minor from the second part of the axillary artery. The first of which is the thoracoacromial artery, and this curls around pec minor superiorly before piercing the costocoracoid membrane and dividing further into branches. Secondly, we have the lateral thoracic artery, and this follows pec minor all the way down to the thoracic wall to supply the lateral breast. Now, from the third part of the axillary artery, we have our final 3 branches. The subscapular artery, which is the largest branch from the axillary artery, travels inferiorly and posteriorly all the way to the inferior angle of the scapula, where it anastomoses with other arteries. Our final 2 branches are the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. These encircle the neck of the humerus and give off branches to supply the humerus and the shoulder joint, while also going on to anastomose with one another laterally. And that sums it up. 1 artery, 3 parts, 5 branches. But before we finish up, let's just quickly run through some of the key points that we looked at today. The axillary artery splits off into 3 parts. The first part runs from the lateral border of the first rib to the medial border of pectoralis minor and gives rise to the superior thoracic artery. The second part runs behind pec minor and gives off the thoracoacromial and lateral thoracic arteries. Finally, the third part carries on from the lateral border of pec minor to the inferior border of teres major and gives off the subscapular, anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. And that's it, the axillary artery and all of its branches covered. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed, remember to like the video and subscribe to see more.